Thank you, Alex. Thank you for the library for letting us use this space. I'm really excited for this conversation and to be with my friends here in Charlotte. I was just in Henderson County. I was able to do sort of a book launch at Malaprop's bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm from Western North Carolina. I'm from Hendersonville. So this is about North Carolina. It's about my home. I recently moved to New York, but still consider this my home, still consider my family and friends to be here. And so it was great to be back there, to have my family in the audience, to be able to have them also listen in Spanish. We were able to provide interpretation. So it was just a great opportunity, but also important to showcase, as Alex mentioned, the continuation of, unfortunately, some of the things that I write about. So I'm just going to read a paragraph of sort of what's in the book. If you're interested, again, would love for you to get a discount if you would like to buy it. So please see me after and I can do that. But then I also want to talk about with Blu and Stefania, who will introduce themselves in just a minute, a bit about their contributions to this important topic in Mecklenburg County and Charlotte and in North Carolina more broadly. So I think of them as folks who I have definitely run ideas by as I was finishing this, doing my PhD program and in the past few years. So I really just appreciate their support too. So throughout this book, I demonstrate three things: the invisibility of crimmigration, or as we refer to, the criminalization of immigration law and procedure. I demonstrate this in counties throughout North Carolina. The second thing I do is talk about the normalization of crimmigration. And the third is to talk about what happens when communities resist. Specifically, I focus on the routine ways that law enforcement and local government agencies collaborate and communicate with ICE throughout the state, focusing on 287G programs, which allow deputized local law enforcement agents to act as ICE officials within local jails. The American Immigration Council explains that under Section 287G of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Department of Homeland Security may deputize selected state and local law enforcement officers to perform the functions of federal immigration agents. Like employees of the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or what we'll refer to a lot throughout this conversation as ICE, so-called 287G officers have access to federal immigration databases, may interrogate and arrest non-citizens believed to have violated federal immigration laws, and may lodge detainers against alleged non-citizens held in state or local custody. So a lot of the book focuses on thinking about the histories, how do these programs come about, and really thinking about the sort of time period from 2006 to 2008 across the state, where we saw many sheriffs across the state wanting to enter into these programs. But I don't stop there. So I also think about, after the sort of this initiation, what happens in those communities over the next sort of 10 years. So I started to look at this in 2015 when I started doing my dissertation research. I met Stefania around that time, and then met Blu afterwards. But I met Stefania at a steering committee here in Mecklenburg County, where in the book I refer to these steering committees as these like facades of a steering committee. So if you think about steering committees, usually you're giving input. This was not what this was. This was I standing up at the front of the room telling you what was going on and taking a few questions, but not really sort of offering an opportunity to give input, real input. And then from there, something that both Blu and Stefania will, I'm sure, talk a lot more about is thinking about 2018 when we saw across the state sheriff elections where community members were really trying to engage with this question of immigration enforcement. We saw places across the state, community members were gathering together, were organizing to really push this narrative that actually we don't have to have these programs. We can be welcoming to immigrants and think about an alternative way for this to exist. And so we sort of will talk a little bit about that too. So I'm going to jump into some questions and just have my co-panelists introduce themselves and tell us a bit about your relation to this topic of crimmigration, or some other term that we use, especially for Spanish speakers, is the polimigra, which means multiple migras, or migra being sort of ICE. So what is your relationship to this? How have you sort of organized around this, or what does that mean to you? So I think we're going to start with Stefania, and then we'll go to Blu.
I did not want to go first. Hey y'all, my name is Stefania Arteaga. During the day, I am co-executive director of the Carolina Migrant Network. We're a legal nonprofit providing legal representation to immigrants in the Carolinas who are in detention. We're the only organization doing so. And so this topic is just very personal to me because I think I don't know how to explain it any other way, but I was brought up in a system of crimmigration. I grew up in East Charlotte, where it was common to hear um, of a neighbor or a friend who was detained for having a flat tire or having no driver's license or having repeating no driver's license stops, and that leading to a deportation. And something that really resonated with me around the intro of Felicia's book was just how habitual these conversations were around the dinner table, and how that was very much how I grew up, is having conversations with my mom on, oh, did you hear que tal y tal persona, so-and-so, was picked up. Tal y tal persona is now in Georgia. And so I moved to Charlotte when I was 13 in 2008. So 2008, if I'm not mistaken, is when 287G started. It started in May, if I'm not mistaken, and I moved in June. So my whole life, conscious life as a teen and now an adult has revolved around this program. And just like the serious intentional criminalization, not only at a local level, but a state level and also a federal level, to further criminalize migration, not just to Latino immigrants, but to immigrants as a whole.
Peace, y'all. I'm Blu. In my day job, I am the organizing director of the North Carolina Black Leadership and Organizing Collective, or NC BLOC. We're a statewide formation committed to shifting the conditions of Black and poor and working class people, because that is not the same class level. And I came into crimmigration in 2016, 2017, in one of my first attempts to try to make an intervention in our GOTV cycles, to really think about what is it that Black people, poor and working class people need, and specifically, how do we organize Black folks in support of immigration reform that support people? Because whether or not folks, the way that we're socialized really dictates how we show up and how we vote and how we care. And so it was really digging deep into like, well, when they do police stops on your block to check for illegal immigrants is what they're saying, and they're checking IDs, they're checking everybody IDs, right? And how many folks in your community got dead tags? How many folks are driving without a license? How many folks are on paper, on parole and probation? And so really starting to think of this as like a human rights issue rather than a racialized issue. And so that was my entry point. And also, we just love turning up on the state.
You said that a little low.
We just turn up on North Carolina all the time because they turn up on us all the
time. You both sort of mentioned this sort of 2016, 2017 period, and we'll come back to the 2008 because I that's sort of central to some of what I wanted to look at in the book, was specifically sort of like what's going on in 2008, right? Across the state, we have probably like 10, 15 sheriffs who are really excited to be part of the 287G program. Some of them sort of ICE determines weren't fit, in quotes, to have the program, but there are plenty of places at that point that adopt the 287G program, and I'm happy to sort of answer more questions about that. But I guess, Stefania, you once sort of mentioned coming in 2008. I guess I'm interested, where you talked about sort of having these conversations, and this is something that happened in my family too, is, right, talking about, what's going to happen if someone gets arrested. But I'm wondering if, like, this is maybe a question about your political consciousness. Like, did you start organizing as soon as you got here, or sort of like, what was that sort of journey for you?
Yeah, so I had actually moved from New Bedford, Massachusetts. Yeah, I know, girl, big shift. I was like, am I at the border? We moved during a heat wave. I had never been, I don't know, in a place so hot in my life. And I mean, I was born in El Salvador, but I came when I was 7. I mentioned New Bedford, Massachusetts, because I lived through the largest workplace raid under the Bush administration in New Bedford. And it was during a time where I think my foundation was rocked. My mom was a journalist by training in El Salvador. She started towards the end of the Civil War there, and when we migrated to Massachusetts, she's continued that work covering migrant communities in Massachusetts and then here in North Carolina. And so when that raid happened in New Bedford, my parents were super scared. We did not have anybody to pick us up from school. My dad ended up picking us up from school and also was scared himself, right? And so we drove past the warehouse where people were still being bussed through, right, throughout the day. And subsequently through that, through our relationships with the local church, because grew up very Catholic in Massachusetts. So, really got involved there. And then I mentioned '08, but I think it's also really important to mention 2010, because it was such a eye-opening time period for young people across the country. That's really when the Out of the Shadows movement began, and people were coming out and publicly saying, I am undocumented. And at that period of time, I had no clue what my status was, but I knew that I was in jeopardy. I knew that local contact with local law enforcement put me in jeopardy. I knew that even a firefighter trying to talk to me in Massachusetts and my dad just being scared. And so it was thankfully thanks to this youth group that I really started thinking about what is the relationship of local law enforcement? What is the relationship with ICE? Who am I, right? Like, what is my identity? And through that, I had the opportunity in 2014 to go to Arizona. This is after Arizona had passed it's like 17 something, 1070. Thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was that one. Anyways, I had the opportunity to go. I joined hundreds of young people. We took over the streets of Phoenix, and I had the opportunity to go to a deportation defense training. And like, again, around this period of time, organizers were trying to figure out what it looked like to launch campaigns on the ground to show support for people who are going through deportation proceedings. Very similar if you look at it in the criminal justice system of like accompaniment to court. If that helps. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I talked a lot, but that's what happened.
No, that's helpful because so I met both of these folks in organizing spaces, and so it's important for me to hear their story, and also they live here, and so the point of this conversation is to make sure that we're hearing from local community members about sort of the work that's been done here, that's been ongoing, that this is still sort of very alive and well. So I also wanted to sort of go back to Blu. You mentioned sort of the 2016, 2017, and started thinking about get out the vote work. Can you talk about sort of like how that was part of this sort of your larger North Carolina work as well?
Yeah, so, BLM, Black Lives Matter, we had a upspringing of college youth, young youth, and I think really young adults under 35 who were starting to be more politically active and demanding power in a visible way. And so we were like, how as organizers do we take that and move it into momentum building and then power building and power shifting? And so in the state of North Carolina, across the state, there was so much happening, from HB2 happening. I think that's around this time. Ignite NC was a training organization across the state of North Carolina who were organizing UNC system. And, a lot of UNC systems and HBCUs were also safe spaces. So we really started thinking about those conversations like, how do we create sanctuary where we are, not only for immigrants, for Black people running from the police? Like, how do we really think about we keep us safe in a real tangible way? We also saw folks, this is when people started unarresting folks. And so people were taking lives, physical people's lives back in their hands from the police. And so we also set up a action center called texting for raids. It didn't work very well. It worked. Really, we had a verification system, so people will text in any ICE spottings, and then we report it out and blast it out to the larger network across North Carolina. Some of them were fake, some of them were not, but it was really about how do we move into keeping ourselves safe? How do we do that at the polls, in our communities, at our churches, wherever folks frequent? And that was the exciting thing. Like I think during that time, movement was hyper visible. And so it's like, what is the messaging that we need to have to make sure that nobody gets left behind? Because usually when we're talking about poor, Black and brown folks, the demands that we want to make sure that we have access to our basic human needs usually get traded off, right? We could fight for 15, but most of the waitresses will still get their $2.25 an hour. It's like, what happened to those folks who primarily are these people? Same thing for migrant workers and laborers. And also we were really interested in how do we give voice to Black immigrants who are also workers and a part of this fight? A part of the U.S. propaganda machine really creates like immigrants from Latin America as like the trope, but everyone else gets erased. And so much so that folks forget that like your home care worker for your mama is probably somebody who could be undocumented. The people who are doing these laborious jobs every day that we see are these folks. And so how do we move into care, love, and concern, and actually shift the power? We did some good work in 2017. Felicia and I, we had a very interesting meeting to really think about how do we make an intervention in the 2018 sheriff elections and DAs. And so we sat in a room really getting together, what does it mean to be progressive? And we launched that, which I always credit to how we saw some of the most prominent or new faces in the sheriff and DA world talking and taking our language and bringing it to the forefront and still winning. Did we get some of those things implemented? No, but we got, the surface one.
So that you said a lot. So let's jump into, so I think about these things chronologically because I had to write it as a timeline in the book. So for me, it makes sense that way. But we were just talking about how, I don't remember which year, right, some of these things are happening. And I think I do because I was like, oh yeah, I had to write a whole chapter on this particular year. So I think the 2017, 2018, so for folks who don't know, sheriff elections in the state of North Carolina happen every 4 years. And Stefania, I'm going to toss this question back to you real quick to talk sort of like maybe give us a quick overview of like what's going on in the sheriff's office maybe in 2018, particularly when it comes to 287G, and then we'll talk more broadly. But sort of, obviously we're here to talk a little bit about the book and talk about crimmigration, but can you tell us sort of like 2018, 2017, 2016, what's happening around sort of the immigration landscape when it comes to sort of the sheriff's office and why also that sort of prompts some local folks like y'all, other folks who are in this room too, to start to really deeply think about how to make an intervention in that sheriff race?
Yeah, so if y'all remember that time, that's when Erwin Carmichael was sheriff. And so around that time, that was, 2018 for sure was his 12th year in the county that Mecklenburg County had the 287G agreement. And around that period of time, around like 15, 16, 17, we started seeing this wave of parents organizing to stay with their children. The vast majority of these parents were individuals who had been stopped for, like I mentioned previously, having a flat tire, racial profiling because they were a painter and they were driving in a wealthy neighborhood and somebody called the police on them, people who had false charges placed on them. And so we were seeing these cases and these parents really mobilizing and organizers. And I really credit them a lot for creating the foundation for us to come in and do the work in 2018. And then at the same time, we're seeing high rates of 16 and 17-year-olds in solitary confinement within the Mecklenburg County Jail. Because remember, we were the last state to charge 16 and 17-year-olds as adults in the country. And that's also when we started seeing a shift in technology within the jail to try to really charge people on the outside to see their loved ones. And so another tax on the poor, right? And so I also just want to really go back to what Blu was saying around like this, I feel like a euphoric moment of like building solidarity. I was like really young when this happened. So I was always the baby. But I saw that intentional, like I had just graduated.
Well, we're not old also.
Just kidding. They're not old. They're not old. Nobody's old. Age is a social construct. And so just like I think that 2018 was because of the groundwork that was built, because Keith Lamont Scott was murdered by CMPD and young people came together. And
can you go back and what's still going on with Keith Lamont Scott if folks are maybe new or don't know the history?
Oh, yeah, he was a Black man who was on the northeast side of Charlotte, who was killed by a CMPD officer. He was waiting in the car for I believe, his child to come off the bus stop. He was reading a book. There was an altercation, and he was subsequently murdered by CMPD. Yeah, I lost my train of thought.
Sorry, Charlotte Uprising. Right. So this prompts the Charlotte Uprising. But I think you were going down the path of also Familias Unidas and the youth group.
We were in this period. I mean, I think of like very and like natural, organic community building with immigrant and Black community members, particularly Latino immigrant community members and Black community members, of what it means to live in a county where we're severely overcriminalized, where the types of, you know, like I want to call it redlining, but, you know, the wedge and the crescent that we constantly hear about was very noticeable when we saw police interactions, right? And so I think that those incidents is what created the trust and the opportunity to come together to really challenge Carmichael. And I think what's really important was that we were telling primarily white allies, like, this is happening. And they're like, oh, we're just going to have dinner with him and talk about it. No, because we were trying to get meetings months and months prior, right? And so really seeing this like disconnect around like an assumption because there was a D behind a name that everything could be fixed. But young people being like, no, it's not happening.
D for Democrat. So this is Carmichael. Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I'm going to try to catch acronyms as they happen. D for Democrat at this time. So Sheriff Carmichael, at the time, Sheriff Carmichael was running for re-election. And so we'll definitely jump into that in a minute and talk about, I think, just some of the tactics that and the organizing sort of strategies that were used, because I really look to sort of Mecklenburg County as like the place where so much started, and sort of other folks, I think, took some of the strategies and were then willing to use those in some of the other sheriff elections across the state too.
And from Charlotte Uprising, we started working with SEAC, which is a Southeast Asian coalition that's here in Charlotte that does that work. And when we really started to think about like immigration and migration, who is actually missing from the conversation, right? And how can we intentionally build with the folks who are already engaging in those communities too?
So then if we're sort of like chronologically, we're in 2018. So what's going on in 2018? I'll come back and give more of a context across the state, but what sort of is going on with sheriff elections? How do y'all intervene if you do in the sheriff elections in 2018? I know, Stefania, you were hanging out outside of different fundraisers. So can you talk about sort of like what the strategies were that y'all decided to do and why? I think you mentioned sort of like the approach that some people were taking, which was, let's sit down with them, let's have these conversations, and why you didn't think that was effective, because I think we do want to hear.
I mean, it wasn't effective because they didn't think that it was worthy to meet with us, because they were going to, by they, I mean the sheriff, Carmichael, would not meet with us. Like, we requested to meet with them. My mom, who was a journalist, I was like, Mom, please help me talk to him. We weren't getting, answers. And so also, to put it into context, around 2018 in February was the first raids we saw under the Trump administration in Charlotte. And it was the first time we saw a shift in the type of technology that was used. So we were being, not only did we have the 287G agreement, right, the deputized sheriffs, but the Charlotte ICE field office was also still using ICE as a test site for technology. And so the raid happened. It was crazy. At that point, you had myself and other directly impacted people driving across Charlotte, trying to find people's vehicles that were being left on Central Avenue, on South Boulevard. And then we were angry. We were angry because we had city council members telling us that this wasn't happening because they talked to ICE. But we had the community members whose vehicles we were finding, who called us because they thought they had a kidnapped or missing family member. And then what we ended up doing was we took the streets. We ended up organizing a day without an immigrant. I don't know if y'all remember, 8,000 people marched on Trade and Tryon, letting city council know that really happened. And then after that, we shut down a couple of city council meetings because they weren't listening. And I think a point that goes back to your book of like, primarily the Latino community was not seen as worthy because we did not have the political power, right? And so our voices, our stories were disregarded. And at the same time, we had a sheriff that when those raids started, he re-signed a 287G agreement. And so even attempts to talk to him were like, no, we're getting the bad guys out. But we knew very well that those checkpoints in East Charlotte, North Charlotte were leading to deportation. So that's kind of where we were around that point. And I think a lot of intentional mutual aid work as well was happening around that time with Charlotte Uprising folks.
In the book, I also sort of highlight, at least for Mecklenburg County, some of these collective questions that were put together that were then sent to sheriff candidates. Do y'all want to talk about some of those and sort of like why collectively there was sort of this approach to think about this is what we want any candidate who's running to commit to?
In movement organizing, community organizing, the thing that really helps is salience of your message, of whatever you want. And it's not only enough to just organize folks for electeds that's based on race or class or wherever they come in from, but it's really explicit to say, let's name what we want when we're thinking about the criminal justice system, the immigration system, and have people decide. They're not going to answer. They're either going to say yes or no. And so if you look at the voter guide or the picture that we have, you see Irwin, every question, do you support ending the 287G agreement? No. McFadden and the other person is like, yes. And down the line, everything is no. And so taking that back is really hard to miss, right? You can't talk past that. You answered this questionnaire and it said no. And so we use that as an organizing tool along with some mailers, and we did ads.
My favorite thing is that we finally had radio on the Spanish language radio, because here's the other thing. Sorry, now I keep talking about the Latino community, but nobody up to that point, no elected or people who was running for election was like, oh, let me put an ad on the Latino radio. No, we were putting ads on the Latino radio. And you know what? The Latino vote went up 110%. That primary, because nobody was intentionally thinking as Latinos as a political force.
But they were. So part of, in my conspiracy theory brain, around why all of the uptick of ICE was happening across the state of North Carolina and Mecklenburg County is because there was a poll prediction that like the biggest voting block in 2018 would be first generation citizens with immigrant parents, right? And so like these are the people who will be able to decide and determine and swing elections in any way. And what way better than to make sure folks don't get to the polls to intimidate them with the police and deportation, right? And like these things are very intentional. And so when we're organizing in one in a response to something, there's always 3 or 4 other causes that are behind it that we don't really get to see, because everyone who is in a different lane is usually in that lane. And so it's very intentional. I would say the state of North Carolina locally and statewide does a really good job at like undermining or preempting our local power on this from the state level, or vice versa. The state will say something that we're trying to move on, and local officials will come out and be against what the state has decided. We've seen that with HB2, with 287G agreements, because after 2018, folks did start passing them. Folks started getting dollar bills in some instances in Durham, and in Fayetteville, there were civilian oversight review boards. Like we were winning a whole bunch of criminal justice bills and things that we were putting out. And so they were like, okay, how are we going to do this? We're going to take it to the state legislator.
Yeah. No, yes. So we will get into that. No, I mean, yes.
Felicia's like, you're going too far on my time.
No, this is good, because I think about it as like, I think you put it nicely, but we were talking about this earlier, that like the preemption comes because people are organizing locally, right? So the sort of state level pushes are because community members have decided, right, that like what's happening at the state level isn't what we want to see. So let's turn it back to our own local communities. And unfortunately, the state legislature steps in, and which is what we're unfortunately under right now as well, right? So, and I just wanted to go back to just because I do think I like the imagery of scorecards. Like I really just like loved the one that was used in 2018 for the sheriff's election. So I'm just going to quickly, Blu already mentioned sort of the 287 jury agreement was one of the things on there. The other was the end of the use of solitary confinement for juveniles in county jails as a practice, pushing for independent oversight investigations for the sheriff office. Currently in North Carolina, to give you some context, I believe McFadden, who's the current sheriff now, and Burkhead, who's the sheriff in Durham, were the only two sheriffs who put that as part of their campaign plan. I'm going to toss that question back to y'all in a bit to ask if that's actually happening here. But these are when we think about sort of the questions, right? These are also, as Blu mentioned, an opportunity for community members to say, hey, have you done this thing, right? It's an opportunity to ask them, have they actually implemented what they were committing to? And then the last one that was sort of one of the questions of the questionnaire was whether or not they were going to work to restore in-person visitation for incarcerated people. So the context there was that around this time across the state, we were seeing a lot of sheriff offices move to just doing virtual visitation. The research suggests, public health researchers show, right, that having in-person visitation helps individuals who are incarcerated, helps their mental stability, and also provides family members the opportunity to see those people, right? Unfortunately, with the pandemic, we saw that actually the use of in-person visitation completely went away for the most part in most jails across the state. Stefania helped with doing some public records requests for all the jails across the state in North Carolina during the pandemic, and we had some research assistants looking at different policies. But that's also what we were finding, is that the sort of the push to use video visitation continued, and unfortunately, it hasn't gone back, right? So now we've seen the sort of increase in that particular use of visitation instead of moving back to also in-person visitation, right? So these are, again, broader criminal justice issues, but because there was this opportunity for collaboration around the questions on these scorecards, on these sort of community conversations, that we can see that there's an opportunity to continue that collaboration, not just here, but in other places across the state too. So I don't know if y'all wanted to add anything else, but then I was going to give a little bit of what else is going on in 2018 across the state too.
Well, I was going to take it a little bit nationally in
Go ahead.
2018. So I was working with the Movement for Black Lives and the Rising Majority. The Movement for Black Lives is a national, international in some places, network of politically leftist Black organizations, and the Rising Majority is a Black-led, multiracial, statewide formation across the country too. And so in 2018, in June, there was a call to action for the Trump administration was like, we need to protect our borders, right? Whatever. And so folks held action in June. It was BLMP, Mi Gente,
BLMP.
the Black LGBTQIA Migrant Project, Undocu Black, the Movement for Black Lives, the Rising Majority, and countless other national formations did a direct action in San Diego at the border, bus people from all over the country to be able to show up for the horrors that were happening at the detention centers and this claim that Trump was making. And I think at this point in time, it was like immigration reform and issues under the Trump administration was already a hot topic, but the atrocities, right? Like people were really actually sharing what was happening to folks during detention. And it's just like, you can either just love humans and like honor people's humanity, or you can like be the vote to go against like just honoring that. And so I think that was from a global and national perspective, a way that like all this momentum locally and statewide just balled up to a point that was like, we could be a part of it.
And I will say, like, locally, like, we put our bodies on the line so many times. Like, when I tell you Carmichael could have deported me the day after seeing me, he could have. And he definitely tried to arrest us. And so I think, like, I also want to put into context how, like, how dangerous those times we were living. Like, simply just walking and not knowing, like, you know, I'll give you an example. It's like when, you know, we're so scared of guns, right, and shootings. Like, then that's something that we currently constantly have in our brains, right? Well, during that whole period of time, I was just walking around fearful that anything could happen. And it just meant that I would return to El Salvador, where I had not gone back since I was 7 years old. Like, we were just doing stuff because we didn't see another way out, but the risk was huge.
Yeah, and one of the things that I talk about in the book too, right, is that I think both of you at various times, especially I think during this moment too, were going to these city council meetings, going to the county commission meetings, going to these sheriff forums, right, and making your voice heard in a way that I think people weren't doing. And I think like I always like, I think people want to sort of have these civil conversations, and it's just like, how can you be civil with people who have threatened to deport you, right, or threatened to arrest members of your family, right? And so I just admire, I think, all of the work that y'all have done. And I'm thinking about sort of in 2018, so here there is this sheriff election, right, that is obviously like getting a lot of attention, obviously like all the work that y'all did. In Wake County at the same time, there's this push to get rid of the 287G program there, with also a long-time sheriff at the time, Donnie Harrison, who was one of the first sort of like, I write about Mecklenburg as also special in some ways because of the previous sheriff, like Pendergraft, who sort of pushes this program, not just here. He gets invited to be part of this national task force to implement the program in other places as well. But Donnie Harrison, who at the time was the Wake County Sheriff in 2018 as well and was running for re-election, he also was very adamant that this program needed to exist. And in 2018, right, McFadden wins, right, beats Carmichael. And across the state, we also see that these sheriffs who have taken a stance specifically on immigration, I do want to get back to this point around like, do they do other progressive and quote policy changes as well? Because I do think it's an important piece. But other sheriffs across the state, most of them who are Black, right? We see this sort of shift in the racial makeup of sheriffs across the state too, which is really important in a place that I won't get too much into the history, but if we recall sort of our Reconstruction history in the South and in North Carolina, at one point in time we did have Black sheriffs prior to Reconstruction, and the backlash that happened when white communities across the state of North Carolina decided that they didn't want to be governed by Black people, right? And so this is sort of across the state in 2018, we see the election of Black sheriffs, which hasn't been seen since Reconstruction to the extent that it was happening in 2018. And not to say that we should always just like elect Black folks, because I think we will come back to that particular point in a second. But I do want to hear from you all sort of like 2018, sort of what shifts, right, with the elections. Did y'all see a shift here locally? Like what sort of like did that feel like for y'all with at least that particular sort of election here?
I mean, we saw significant shifts. So again, we're like a blue county, so we have to put that in there because everything's decided in May, y'all. Everything's decided in May. Let's think about that, right? There's always the Democratic primary for the most part is what decides things. And so, March, yes. And so what we saw, not like the sheriff's election also impacted the county commissioner's race. Prior to that, the city council's race. And so we saw huge shifts also in the makeup of the county and city leadership. I think at some point, if I'm mistaken, like the election prior to the sheriff's election in 2017, we had like the young, like something around like millennials and technically a millennial. Millennials in city council, Braxton Winston and the Clintons, and it was the whole thing. So yeah, I mean, I think there were some like wins, but I think a lot of it was also to your point of going back to like, what did we win? I think there was like intentional framing and messaging around being very pro-immigrant, because that was the buzz topic of that era, and running with that while dismissing the needs of Black community members in the city for sure.
Can you say more? What do you mean? So like, so the narrative is pro-immigrant. Are you saying that there was some other policies that maybe didn't get advanced? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. I think like, and often the case is, I think also we need to talk about like the complexity of race. And when we look at particularly Latinos in Mecklenburg County, even the resettlement of Latinos around the Central Avenue corridor was intentionally, folks were intentionally placed there, let's say, to create a wedge between Black and white populations. So we have to also take that into consideration. And then we also have to take into consideration that there's also like this weird proximity to whiteness that exists. And so when we talk about Black issues, there is obviously racism that exists. And so I think it was easier, or at least like the perception that I got, it was easier to talk with folks about immigrants because it's just poor immigrant families, right? But it was difficult to talk with folks about Black families. And that is the perception that I had.
And even the overlap between those two. I think for the state, what we won was that shift, and to be able to claim like, yo, we moved these sheriffs and DAs in places where there had been alt-right, extremely racist sheriffs, right? We replaced them. Was the replacement, did they all come out and do the things that they said that they were going to do and what we needed them to do? Not all the time, but within in itself, it was a win in a place where we continuously have been seeing losses from the state, from our local representatives. And we got folks talking and being able to name like the misinformation that they were being given about immigrant ICE deportations, roadblock setups. Like, like I was having a conversation with one woman in 2018 when I first met her. She's like, yeah, put up, check them. And I was like, who are your neighbors? And she's like, I don't know. And I was like, it's no way you lived in Charlotte for 15 years, you don't know your neighbors. Like, go ask your neighbors what they think. And she followed up with me and she was like, oh, I have 4 families who are immigrants in my community that I love and I didn't even know. And I was like, yeah, we have to actually start having these conversations because that propaganda will get you and is strong. I think we also I feel like the dream work in HBCUs, but I'm not going to speak on something I don't really know too much about. But there was a lot of talk about larger policy platforms. So expanding the DREAM Act, extending the temporary protective status to more solitudes, stationary strong one. And so some of those things were put in the forefront, whereas like they had just been things that folks had been opting into without the threat or knowing that it could be snatched away.
So I got the signal that we need to start wrapping up. So I just have sort of like 2 more questions, I think. So given sort of the context of what's happened, what else still needs to happen? I think some of you started to touch on that. And also if you think about sort of like what are some action items people can take away from this? Obviously, I think, I don't know if we already mentioned some of the state legislation. No, I'm just like, I've talked about it. Right. I've talked about it. So yeah. So those are sort of the 2 questions, like what still needs to happen here locally or sort of state level, but also what are we sort of like going to be seeing and what do we need to take action on?
Yeah. I want to give a shout out to Becca, who's back there. She's our co-ED at the Carolina Migrant Network. And I want to say, like, as far as like Sheriff McFadden's promises, as far as immigration goes, he went all the way. But as far as the other policies that I think we really need to go back and look at is definitely solitary confinement, right? I ended up stopping keeping track, but I think at some point we were looking at 8 deaths in a matter of 4 years in the jail, and that's very worrisome, very worrisome. And so I think that doing good in one area doesn't make the rest obsolete. And so I think there's a lot that I'm still very interested in knowing and figuring out how we can shift, particularly around the deaths that are happening, and also about like in-person visitation, right? Like that is huge, and it continues to. And I think like we can't put every elected official cannot be put up in a pedestal, right? Like they're never going to know all the issues, and they 100% need to be held accountable by their constituents, even those who can't vote, because we also know that Black people are disenfranchised from voting, and more because of the General Assembly. And so that's like statewide countywide that I think that I really want folks to think about. For me, like the deaths in the jail have been very startling. Like these are lives that are lost. These are young people. I think the youngest one, I was older. I was just like a year older than him. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done there. The second thing about just like our state legislature, you asked me this question, what we were doing to bring attention to this issue. We're practicing what's called bird dogging techniques. And so bird dogging techniques are techniques where you show up where those electeds are and you make noise. And you make noise by having signs, by serving them with public records requests that they won't respond to, but they showed up to a public location and you're there presenting them the paperwork. You're asking them questions. You're educating community members. You're yelling if you have to, whatever it might be. And so because of that intentional organizing work that was done across various platforms, various communities, the state legislature retaliated. We have HB 40 that is now criminalizing protests. And that's also, this bill also just just happens to have passed right before a huge presidential election. And now after June 15th, we run the risk of HB 10, this bill that was crafted by the main sponsor, Dustin Hall, and the Charlotte ICE field office to make it state law that all sheriffs collaborate with ICE. That is about to pass. And if that happens, just to put it into context, in the 12 years that 287G was present in our county, 15,000 people were placed in removal proceedings. This is not accounting the last year, 2018. And so if you think about it, 15,000 people, primarily if you look at the data, were men. And this is not to play into gender roles or anything, but primarily these folks were the primary breadwinners. That's what we see in the practice, right? The families are heavily impacted. These are families that have children that are U.S. citizens, mixed status households that are gonna face significant generational outcomes because they lost a loved one due to criminalization. So I think also, like, I don't want to just say, let's go and vote, right? Like, that's something y'all should already be doing to begin with. But also I want to say, like, show up, right? Question these elected officials. Be okay with being uncomfortable, making these questions and demands. And I think, like, that's where we need to be okay with, is that in order to have change, we just need to be uncomfortable and make everybody else uncomfortable because we need to make progress.
What? Listen. This 2024 election is going to be a very, I believe fundamentally that it will dictate how we will be existing in the next 10 years of our lives. And the way that our country works right now, especially in southern states to the Midwest, is like there's policy pipeline, okay? If it start in Florida, then get passed in Florida, it comes up North Carolina, South Carolina, goes through Texas, goes to Minneapolis, goes to Chicago. It doesn't. If it starts in Chicago or wherever else in or Illinois, it comes down. And so the things that we're seeing some states, very few, with strong protections on immigration reform. And then some states were like, let's just call them out, right? And so right now there's a call to boycott Florida for the bill that DeSantis just put. And this is like, that is DeSantis, whatever, you know. Right now, there's a call to action on May 31st. The People's Power Coalition is hosting a day of action and then some collective actions across the summertime around a lot of the rights that this General Assembly is trying to roll back. Healthcare, we did just one Medicaid expansion, immigration, schools, critical race theories, teachers' pay, public sector pay. Like, these are big things that impact a lot of us, especially coming on the outskirts or like trying to recuperate from COVID, right? Going into this economic, whirlwind that we're inside of, especially with housing and food and all of this stuff. And so really getting in action, like join an org. There's orgs here in Charlotte, there's orgs here across the state. But most of all, in 2014, for the primary election, okay, start doing your research. If you don't get a little ad in the mail, do it and tell people your list. Even if okay, I think you agree with us. To be able to make informed decisions, because whatever is decided in our primary is who we're going to be stuck with. And right now it's like, the right against everybody else, the leftists, but it's really like the poor and working class against the middle high class folks with a lot of income and resources. And they will dictate and move us towards a fascist system where our rights will no longer be what we decide. They will be telling us, and our corporations will determine a lot. You know, I could go into lobbying and all of those things. I don't want to be like post-apocalyptic, really sad and drab, but I do believe that we have enough people power across the state of North Carolina and in this county to actually continue to shift and make sure our conditions don't change too much or become much more worse than they are now.
Yeah, and I think I'll just end with this sort of question and that I conclude the book with is how do accountability structures develop and persist? Obviously, Stefania and Blu consistently do this, but I think the challenge in the action request for all of you is to do it on your own as well, right? Or with communities, groups, and to follow the lead of people who are directly impacted. This can be something as simple as, right, going to your city council meeting, going to your county commissioner meetings, right? The budgets are about to be passed for both city council and county commissioners. If they haven't already, I think we still got a little time, right? And so a lot of the work that Blu and I have done together in the past few years is specifically focused around budget advocacy at the local levels. The organizations that we support mostly take a divestment investment approach, meaning trying to divest from the carceral systems and invest in community-based programming. So for us, this is also very local, right? Like, yes, a national election is coming up, and
the governor, okay? I'm not talking about the president. I'm talking about the governor and the legislative body and the sheriffs and the DAs and your school board and all of the people who make decisions. The presidential election is going to be the presidential election, but the local down ballot races really matter. Yeah, you know, I always think like, if something happened and your state became a country, would you want to live there? Right? Think about it. Oh, sorry to derail. If not, we need to change some stuff.
We're happy to talk about local elections all day, every day. But we also would like to take some questions. I think we have a little bit of time. If folks have questions for any of us up here. Or for the room, I guess you can also take questions from them.
Today was very interesting and intriguing. And I guess my question is for anyone or all three of you would be for average citizens like myself, others in the room. Sometimes it's very difficult to understand all the legislation, that's coming down and what it means. So what is a way that we can, or resources that we can turn to help us understand it better, to be able to better advocate? Particularly for students. I had an issue a couple of years ago when I worked for another organization where one of my students, he volunteered. It was just make a long story short, he voluntarily went back to Honduras because it was getting closer to him turning 18. And I'm not sure what that rule or law was. He was undocumented as well as his mother, but his little brother, had been born here, so they weren't worried about him having to leave. And so we had to reach out to, we did everything we could, reach out to Congressman Alma Adams. We wrote letters. We did everything possible. But he did have to go back. But because of social capital and really the grace of God, he was able to get back here within 6 months. But that was one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever had to deal with, because phenomenal student, great community service leader, at an early age, and wasn't even, I'm like, he can't even stay here to finish school, his senior year. It was just ridiculous. So that's kind of where my wanting to know more and better understand so I can be a better advocate.
So this is the power community. Somebody reached out to me about that case. Yep, because I'm part Honduran. Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. So that goes back to Blu's point about being intentional about knowing your neighbors, first of all. And I think second of all, being intentional about figuring out what are the institutions that you believe are giving you non-biased information. I think we're going through a crisis of lack of critical thinking skills in this country. And we just take things for face value. And we see that through this division with media, right? And I think not just because we have our local WFAE station here, but I love NPR. I feel like something about the monotone voice telling me that the world is ending gives me so much.
Yeah. Are there some local organizations?
Local organizations. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think follow us at the Carolina Migrant Network on our social medias. If you're not on our list, you can register to be part of our list online. We're doing our best to educate folks not only what's if you are registered to our list, you may have read our last newsletter on Title 42. And then maybe once HB 10 passes, because it's going to, you get to read about that if you register in advance. But I think being very connected to organizations that have an ear to the ground, I don't think Blu gets enough credit. Like, I credit the NC BLOC as like such a important organization for my development and the development of our org. I think we're literally have been supported and continuously standing on the shoulders of Black leaders who have taught us how to do this work. And I think go to their social media and follow them.
You can follow us at NC BLOC. We also will be hopefully in the fall time for our Fall into Freedom, be hosting a series of conversations around the current political hot topics with some diverse understanding, but it centers Blackness, poorness, working class folks, but we'll go beyond so that folks can actually be moving with more information and make informed decisions. And if you don't have access to that, just think about what your values are when you are going to vote for somebody, when you are going to stand up for someone, when you're going to make an action, and make sure that they're in alignment with your values. I don't know if y'all might have some questionable values. If you got questionable values, just maybe you sit this one out. It's better for you to stay home. But I think that always helps me to be able to determine how should I be moving. If you love somebody, reach out and touch somebody.
I also think locally, some of the Action NC folks do also have legislative updates. If you would like to follow some of their updates.
And the Black and Brown policy work, Advanced North Carolina.
ACLU has a really, the ACLU website has a really cool tool that if you go on their search engine and look for a specific issue, it will automatically repopulate the latest update on a specific bill per issue. I used to work at the ACLU, so I can tell you it works. And I strongly recommend it.
Other questions?
We had time for one more question. Churches, of course, politically run the gamut, but as places to meet, to reach out to, as a big part of the community, places to bring people together as advocates. What's been? I know we only have a couple of minutes, but has your experience with that been good, bad? What do you recommend to the people here as far as using the churches?
Yeah, I think since the uprising, up until recent, I and my organization have been doing intentional organizing with the church. Mostly UUs, Unitarian Universalists. Sorry if I said that wrong. And Black churches who are really committed to sanctuary. We approach them through sanctuary. If ICE is rolling, are y'all gonna say no, right? Or can people come here if they're threatened? And we did that. We usually also, if folks invite us to our two churches to speak about things, it usually just depends on the pastors. Some folks are pushing a very a pro-right agenda at their church. And so I think that through invitation, I'm happy to come or find some folks to come. And it is a really good, useful organizing tool. It's just always how do we approach the church sometimes, Because especially if we have a platform, it's if they find a no on one thing, they usually are stay away.
Yeah, I think, I've definitely been kicked out of churches we're obviously a pro-LGBTQ organization, and so definitely been kicked out of a few. But I will say during the campaign work, I think the UU church off of Randolph, sorry, not Sharon Amity, that church has been very supportive. I also wanted to point out Marsha Kelly, who was here earlier, when right before, gosh, I'm sorry, the years just don't make sense anymore. But right before Trump left, one of the things that happened is that they were doing mass deportations from detention centers and mass releases. So there were people that were being placed in Greyhound stations. And so we ended up working and creating a network, and then Marsha and Nicola ended up taking it on, and it's being maintained 3 years later through church folks. And so there is that, but there's also that, concern if folks kicking you out because you're pro-LGBTQ or we're pro-repro rights, right? We've had to make decisions of not applying to funding because we believe in bodily autonomy. And so I think it's a complex one.
No.
Yes, your turn.
Okay. I don't think I need to use this. So let's go back to 2018 and such, particularly around that's my area where I live.
Yeah.
I saw that happen. I had a house painter who was a friend of mine who saw his next door neighbors completely disappear, vanish. I did a little bit of volunteer work with Comunidad Colectiva back then. It didn't feel like we got a whole lot of traction. Was 287G in effect in Mecklenburg County then, and it was abolished by Sheriff McFadden, or is that how it was?
Are you talking about before, were the raids happening at the same time that 287G was in place?
Was in place in Mecklenburg County.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yes. So in 2018, actually, Mecklenburg County ranked top 25th in the country out of all 3,000 counties in the country for the most amount of detentions through the sheriff's department and through on-the-ground arrest. So Mecklenburg County has repeatedly been used as a testing site by the Charlotte ICE field office, and partly due to the lack of, and honestly, investment locally in immigrant rights infrastructures. So Becca and I currently run the only legal organization in North and South Carolina that provides representation for people in detention centers.
Thank you to Felicia for writing the book. I think it's not often that we see this type of work being done, particularly in places like North Carolina, to have an in-depth look at those policies and those numbers. So again, thank you, Blu and Stefania. Thank you for the work that you do. And to the question that was asked about organizations, although we're not a advocacy organization, History Museums is another organization that you can look to understand where have we been, what happened 20, what happened 50, you went all the way back to Reconstruction, what happened during that time to see where we're going next. So do visit history museums, not just the Levine Museum, but any of the history museums in the state. And again, thank you all for coming out tonight.